Please stand by. Your program is about to begin. Should you need audio assistance during today's conference, please press star and 0. Good day and welcome to the Bayer Beyond the Basics conference call. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Dr. Frank Wong. Please go ahead, sir.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon and welcome to our first Bayer Beyond the Basics webinar of the 2012 season. I'm Frank Wong, Technical Service Specialist with Bayer, and I'm here with my good colleague Jimmy Johnson, Head of Marketing for Fungicides. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Lee Miller with us here today, who will be presenting on teeing up your fungicide program for summer season success. And before we get started with the webinar today, just a few housekeeping items. Okay. As far as the webinar instructions, if you are listening as a group, please make sure that each individual signs into the webinar or email Catlin O'Shaughnessy Coffrin, her email's posted there, with your additional attendee names to make sure that all the participants receive credit for attendance. All participants in today's webinar will be in the listen-only mode, so please make use of the Q&A interface in the web browser there, and you can type your questions into the box there, and those questions will be submitted to us, and myself and Jimmy will be addressing those questions directly to Dr. Miller at the end of the seminar. If you could, please include your location with your question. For example, this is Mike from Philadelphia asking a question about dollar spot. Something like that would be great as far as just getting an understanding of where you are in the country. And definitely, if you are experiencing technical difficulties during the presentation, you can't hear the presentation, or you're running into problems with the web interface, please send a question through the Q&A panel, and our technical staff will help you kind of address those issues. Okay, this is the first of our webinar series, and we've got a number of them this year. Just a quick reminder, on April 24th, I'll be talking about minimizing summer stress for cool season turf grass. On Tuesday, May 15th, Dr. Mike Richardson will be talking about the latest and greatest turf gadgets that you can use for turf management. And on Tuesday, June 19th, Dr. Rick Lattin will be addressing a problem of emerging concern, which is this bacterial decline of creeping bentgrass. So make sure to check those out at our Backed by Bayer website, backbybayer.com/beyondthebasics, for a full schedule of our webinar series for 2012. Okay. Additionally, you'll be receiving GCSAA credits for education, and you'll have to submit those approval codes to GCSAA within 30 days of this event, and you'll be receiving that code at the end of the presentation today. So just make sure to stay long enough to receive that code. If you have any questions about receiving education credits, please send Jennifer Miltner at Global Prairie a quick email, and she'll take care of you there. Also, just a reminder that in participating in today's webinar, you'll be receiving 2,000 Bayer accolades points for this webinar today. And if you can attend 4 webinars throughout the 2012 season, you'll receive an additional bonus 4,000 Bayer accolades points. Okay, so without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, a good friend and colleague, Dr. Lee Miller. Dr. Miller is the Extension Turfgrass Pathologist for the state of Missouri. He got his PhD at North Carolina State University and his master's degree at the University of Georgia. Between degrees, Lee worked for 4 years as the manager of turfgrass research at Chicago District Golf Association, and for his PhD work, did a very comprehensive job at looking at fairy ring management. So with that, Dr. Miller, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm glad everybody's getting bonus points for listening to me speak today. That's kind of nice. I'd like to also thank Bayer for this opportunity to speak today on this subject that I've been working with in my farrowing research, but it's kind of blended over into a full disease management strategy of how to get your fungicide program up and going. When I talk about fungicide programs, I tend to use the analogy of a golfer walking up to the first tee. So for me, I have one thought in mind, and that's to get the ball down the fairway. Now there's an alternative strategy, which is to put it as far down as possible, where you would go ahead and pick up a driver. But for me, I like to pick up a 3-wood because for the most part, I'm usually not very warmed up. But I also just want to make sure that I get that ball down the fairway and in good playing condition. So for fungicide programs, can really help us to get down the fairway off of that first tee. So it's interesting. I thought that this would be a really timely seminar, particularly in the transition zone of the United States and also for the Northeast to be ahead of the game. But this crazy summer that we're having, and notice I didn't say spring, is really kind of got us about 3 weeks ahead here in Missouri, and I would say that's pretty much true for all of the Midwest. So when we talk about starting our fungicide programs, we often use that term preventative. And I think that it's very important that we understand what preventative really means. We tend to hear it all the time, but it's really a thought process of applying our controls before either our pests or our plant symptoms appear. And it's important in this preventative strategy that we're actually tying the fungicide or the pesticide application to the biology of the pest, which can be very different from when we actually see symptoms on the plants. So in the herbicide and insecticide world, this is a well-known strategy. So right now, pre-emergence for crabgrass prevention are flying off the shelves, and this is tied to a specific soil temperature threshold, which is 50 to 55 degrees. We're definitely in that category now here in Missouri, throughout the state, so crabgrass prevention is going down. Similarly, Poiania seed head suppression follows a degree day model based off of base 32. So here in Missouri, again, we're applying, actually we're almost too late for applying seed head suppression applications. And lastly, to get into the insect world, our grub control, we apply those controls well before we actually see outbreaks and damage onto our turf areas. So for our foliar diseases in particular, we have to add in moisture as an extra component. So that makes it kind of difficult for us to really accurately predict foliar diseases. Now I say that, and Oklahoma State University and the University of Wisconsin are working on a really robust and accurate dollar spot prediction model that should help us to more accurately time those preventative fungicide applications. So we have another category of turf diseases, however, and that's our soil-borne turf diseases. And really the main driver for those is solely temperature. So the first one that you see here is take-all patch. The major host is creeping bentgrass. Its infection is favored by cool or wet soils, and the infections occur in the fall and actually mostly in the spring. Because of temperature being that main driver, preventative fungicides for take-all patch are recommended to be applied preventatively when our 2-inch soil temperatures reach a range between 40 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's kind of a broad range, but that's what's listed thus far. Summer patch is another soil-borne turf disease. The pathogen is Magnaportha poe. Our major hosts historically are our bluegrasses, both annual and Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass on sports fields and roughs, and annual bluegrass on greens. That last one listed there is creeping bentgrass, and this was first reported in 2008 in North Carolina as summer patch being a disease on creeping bentgrass, and In the last 2 years, as the name implies, summer patch, with our last two really heavy summers, intense summers, I've seen creeping bentgrass also have summer patch here in the Midwest, in northern Arkansas and also in southern Missouri. So I think this might be more of a widespread pathogen, particularly in our more intense heat stress summer years like we've had in 2010 and 2011. For the most part, summer patch, the infection process is favored by warmer soils than take-all patch. The infections occur in the spring. We're not sure if they also occur in the fall when soil temperatures go down. I did do a short study looking at fall preventative applications for summer patch for the next spring, or the next summer, excuse me, and have found that they were not very good. So I think our main window for summer patch control is in the spring as well as for take-all patch. However, because they're favored by warmer soils, the preventative time or the threshold to apply the preventative fungicides are when the 2-inch soil temperatures reach 65 degrees. So if we look at that on a graph, and this is how I kind of think of the spring season, is a graph of when the soil temperatures start to increase. And if I were to draw this season's, it probably might not let me do it, but it would be much steeper and it would be much earlier than you see there. So for take-all patch, we have about the first time that you want to make an application is 55 degrees, and summer patch is 65 degrees on this graph. Some of the effective fungicide classes for both of these diseases are our QOI fungicides, whether they be Heritage or Insignia, and then also the second class here, which are the demethylation inhibitors, or the DMIs, which are Banner, Balaton, or what I call the T's, which are Trinity, Triton, and Turney. So how to monitor soil temperatures? I get this question quite often, and you can do it a variety of ways. The first there in the picture on your far left is an automated weather station. You can have that come into a computer console and have everything done fairly automatically for you with the soil temperature probe and with your reporting. The problem with this is obviously it's a little bit more expensive. Some of these systems can be a couple $1,000s at least. The second one there in the middle is to actually do it the old-fashioned way and to go out and take the soil temperatures yourself. So when I tell superintendents to do this, I normally tell them to go out at 11 o'clock a.m., maybe right before lunch, because this gives us the best average soil temperature between our nighttime temperatures and our higher daytime temperatures. So if you just take that and record it day after day, you'll get a pretty good approximation of the daily average. The last one there is to guesstimate using our average air temperature on sand-based greens. And this isn't quite as accurate, obviously, as getting them yourself. But on a sand-based putting green, it can be fairly close to what the average air temperature is for the day, just particularly if there's not a lot of water in the system and if there's a lot of pore space. But lastly, I'd also like to mention that you can take advantage a lot of times of what your state gives you. So here in Missouri, we have, these are Horizon Point reports, and these get emailed to me every day. And they track the soil temperature and actually give you a very nice graph. Now this is under bare soil, the 2-inch temperature, but it gives you a pretty good approximation of where you are versus your 12-year mean. And a lot of times if you can go ahead and, I call it stealing from the agricultural weather stations in your state, you can get some of this good weather-based information. So where are we now? That's the major question, and I alluded to it earlier and said that we're about 3 weeks ahead of time. Now that being said, this is the total 30-year normal for Columbia, Missouri, this graph, where I'm located now, and it kind of shows the temperature deviations from 2007 to 2012. You can see they're highlighted were our very hot summers of 2010 and 2011. But what I really like to highlight here is that we're about 5 months in a row now of being above normal temperatures. So we had a very, very warm winter. I'm not an entomologist. I don't know what that'll do for insects. But for pathology and for diseases, I would think that we're going to have a lot of earlier outbreaks this year in this region because of this kind of lack of a winter. I've heard it termed as the winter that wasn't, but also because of our very hot March that we're going through right now. If you look throughout the whole United States, we're above normal pretty much almost everywhere except for the western portions of the country. So this winter was the 4th warmest winter on record. For Missouri, it's the 3rd warmest winter. Missouri is also on track, and I know this is true for my neighboring states. We're on track for the warmest March ever. So we definitely need to be, if you haven't made a preventative application yet, it probably should be in the works for it very, very soon for the Midwest, and I would say very soon for the Northeast as well. So, as Frank mentioned, I did a lot of work at North Carolina State on farriering, and it's kind of my baby. It's my favorite disease, and because I'm a turf pathologist, I can have a favorite disease. Most people would not admit to that. But farriering, the reason that I am drawn to it so much is because it is, in my mind, the most complex pathosystem in turfgrass pathology, if not in all of plant pathology. The reason for this is just the variety of symptoms and the variety of pathogens that actually make up this disease complex. So farriering can cause a variety of ring types. They're classified there as type 3, which is basidiocarp formation, which is just, if I say basidiocarp, that means just mushrooms or puffballs. And those can form in rings. Type 2 rings are rings of luxuriant growth, which is correlated to the release of plant-available nitrogen in the form of ammonium by these fungi that are degrading lignin in the thatch layer of your putting green or your turf system. So one important thing to note here is that farriering fungi, basidiomycetes, are just doing what they naturally do in nature, which is to degrade lignin. And if it wasn't for this class of fungi, we'd be walking on logs all day. So particularly in forest ecosystems, they're very important for wood degradation. Lastly there, and this is when it becomes a problem, is that type 1 rings, which are rings of necrotic turf, which normally occur in our heat stress periods, and which also correlates to when the fungi's metabolism is really up and running. Second bullet point there is that they're present at various depths in the profile. I would say for putting greens, for the most part, they're limited to the top inch because that's where their major food source is. So I don't know about you, but I tend to stay pretty close to home because that's, or to my favorite restaurants because that's where my food source is. The third point there is that it's very complex because it causes these type 1 symptoms in a variety of ways. So the main way that we actually, necrotic rings develop is because of the hydrophobicity that farriering fungi impart on the soil profile. So if you can see laid water droplet onto the soil profile. But the yellow arrow there is a droplet that has been there for 3 days and is yet to infiltrate that soil core. So you can imagine what's going on in your summer stress period. You have this hydrophobic layer, which is caused not only by the mycelium itself, but also the organic acids that it's producing from the lignin degradation. You can imagine that if you're not getting water in after 3 days, and this is actually in a Tupperware dish, that the plants aren't able to get any water or nutrients, and particularly during high stress periods, this leads to the turf decline. There are some other ways listed there. I think, in my mind, that probably the second one in line there is probably the ammonium toxicity. The reason for that is that in some of these luxuriant rings, the green rings, we can have ammonium levels that are up to 600 parts per million. So that can also predispose the turf to going down. Lastly there, and the reason that I believe that fairing is so very difficult to control is that it's not one particular pathogen species, or it's not one particular fungi that cause fairings. It's associated with a reported 60 different Basidiomycete species. So that makes a lot of our control practices very site-specific to, and some fungicides maybe won't work on certain fungi as well as others. This is just a picture of type 2 and type 3 symptoms. So one thing to note is that we can have these symptom types occur all at one time or individually. So this picture was taken in late spring, and here you can see the type 2, which is the green ring, and the type 3, which is the basidiocarps. In this case, these are puffballs, lycoperdon type puffballs, which we've seen mostly in the southeast. So this picture was taken in North Carolina. And then when the summer stress occurs, the monster that's lying underneath your beds, which you may have seen with the green rings, can turn into this quite quickly. So this is, you've got a real large development here of a hydrophobic mat. You can see there that this ring has been aerified to try and punch through that hydrophobic mat layer, which is important. This is an A4 putting green. And then not to leave out our friends down south, this is a tip eagle putting green. And one thing you'll note here is that it almost looks like tree ring symptoms. So that outer ring, the brown ring, is where the current infection process is taking place, and where the current process is for that year and development of that fairy ring. And then that inner ring, which is the black algae, is last year's damage. So you can see how long it can take to remediate the soil physical properties and to get that the water relations going back in when we have fairing that's set into a soil profile. So for curative control, this is data from Dr. Bruce Martin at Clemson University, published in Golf Course Management. And what's really striking here and what this graph represents is the difference between applying fungicides curatively for fairing with and without wetting agents. So you notice the blue bar there, the second one from the left, is heritage without revolution, and then right next to it is heritage with revolution. Similarly, you have insignia without revolution next to insignia plus revolution. You can see the striking decrease and the control that you get when you add a wetting agent with curative applications. So we had some hints before I got to North Carolina State to start this research that the DMIs might be well used in a preventative strategy. All of our fungicides had been prescribed curatively, but this was one that kind of goes more along the lines of the take-all patch and the summer patch, as far as applying before we saw symptoms develop. So here this graph represents two applications made in late March and late April. There you can see that Balaton with revolution, without revolution, is suppressing fairing much greater than what we have with curative applications, or our traditional curative fungicides, I should say. So these are two applications with ProStar and Insignia, not providing the level of control that our DMI, our Balaton, is in this two application early spring strategy. So we had a clue, we had something to work with, but as researchers we always have more questions to answer. So what we wanted to get at is, we knew that 2 ounces would work. Could we make just one application of either 1 ounces or 2 ounces of Balaton and achieve the same amount of control? So all of the fungicides on the left were applied only once. You can see tebuconazole was also applied in a different formulation as the products that are out now. And then on the right, the second thing we wanted to get at with this particular field trial was when was the most accurate application timing? And we wanted to base this off of soil temperatures like we had done with take-all patch and with summer patch, or at least other researchers had done, to try and get to this, what does preventative really mean, and what is the time frame that we should be applying to achieve the greatest level of residual control. So this is a graph of the soil temperatures of 2007 and 2008. You can see on the y-axis there, it's an average 5-day soil temperature. So what we were going for was a nice even curve of the increase of soil temperatures through the spring. And really the idea here is to try and stop failure when it's a match, as opposed to when it's a raging fire and we have that hydrophobic condition set in. It should be noted that in 2007, the first year of this trial, that we actually had failure start before our last application, that application F, at the 75-degree threshold. Therefore, we know that this is not an accurate preventative threshold for failure and is actually too late in the spring season. So I always get the comment that as turfgrass pathologists, we like the death and devastation pictures. But in actuality, this is probably the most favorite picture that I've ever taken. And it's because we're actually stopping fairy ring or the disease problem right on the line. So this is taken in June 13th. Again, this is only one application of Balaton at the high rate, made at that 65-degree threshold, which placed it somewhere about in late March. So we're about 2.5 months beyond this application. The problem is unfortunately, and I should say that Balaton at the low rate controlled just about as well as the high rate did, so we didn't see any really big rate differences. But I should say that as we got on farther into the season, particularly into later into July, that fungicide, that single fungicide application broke down. So this is Balaton at the low rate at 65 degrees, so that threshold. So what that tells us is that we can't get away with just one application, and we probably should go more along the line of the pre-emerge crabgrass model, and we need to maybe split the applications. So this is that the full trial, all 3 years in graph form. And on the left, the y-axis there, that AUDPC means area under the disease progress curve. And what that basically means is it's one number that gives us a snapshot of all the disease severity ratings for that entire year. So you have to look at it in that respect, that this is not just one single rating date, but instead this is all the rating dates combined. So in 2007, you can see that we had much less varying in the DMI treated plots. And again, this is just one application. A little bit more with the Balaton, the 1 ounce, but not really significantly different from the 2 ounces. We also had good control with the tebuconazole. 2008, in that left graph, again, we're seeing the same thing. And in 2009, the varying was so low in the plot that we could not get any statistical difference between our treatments. Now, there could be a lot of things that are going on there, but I really think that this is promising, because I think this means that we're really impacting the pathogen here, and we're actually really decreasing the amount of disease severity that we have in those plots. I should also mention that in 2010, on the same plot, varying trial was tried again, and they could not get the significant difference. In the right graph there, this is just looking at the soil temperature thresholds. And you can see there that we didn't have a whole lot of statistical difference. You can see in 2007, the 75 degrees was too late. But if you look at a data trend, it seems to indicate that the 55 to 60 degree soil temperature threshold is probably that sweet spot in that window of when you want to try and make that first application. So when we came out with this recommendation, of course, it formulated more questions than answers. So we tried to refine this control recommendation, and this is how I kind of always think about our fungicide recommendations, is that they're always kind of fluid. You know, I think that we should always try to be working with them in our research programs and trying to make them more effective and to try to increase the amount of residual control that we get out of each one of these applications. So the first question that we had is, well, you know, when I make a curative application, do I always put the wetting agent in? You know, will this hurt the performance of fair-ring fungicide applied preventively? And then also, is there any impact on phytotoxicity? With DMI fungicides, every once in a while, particularly if there's a heat event, we can get a phytotoxic or kind of a bronzing of the turf grass. And then that second point there was superintendents would say, you know, it's Tuesday, I've got ladies' day, they're starting at 7:30. I really don't want to apply this amount of water, which we watered in with a full quarter of an inch. We don't want to do this and really impact play. Can we wait and water in these applications that night instead of immediately after application? So we designed a factorial experiment, again there with Balaton at the low rates and Triton at the low rates, and both of those were applied twice. So they were applied in late March and late April when our soil temperatures were between 55 and 60. The second factor there was irrigation. We either watered the fungicides in immediately or we watered them in 10 hours later to simulate a night irrigation cycle. And then the third factor there was wetting agent. We either tank mixed in Revolution at the label rate of 6 ounces per thousand, or we did no wetting agent. And again, when we talk about watering in, we watered all these in with a full quarter inch of water, and I can tell you that that is a lot of water. It did pond up and did slightly, we were just about to the point of runoff off the plots. So this is another one of those favorite pictures, and I affectionately refer to this as my fairy square. So the outline that are surrounding that are Triton. So we were able to see that triticonnazole could also be used as a DMI fungicide in this preventative fungicide application strategy for fairy ring. You can see here that this is into July, so we're into July 21st, and we've got applications made in late March and late April that are holding on until this late date. What was interesting is that in our untreated plots, the one that's outlined there has Revolution without the fungicide. So we did see some decrease in the plots that just had Revolution to them. So I should say that wetting agents should be applied on their regular schedule. However, I don't think that they should be tank mixed in with the preventative fungicide applications. So if you notice, there's not a statistical difference here, but there is a data trend, and this is consistent between years, that when we applied either the Balaton or the Triton and tank mixed it with the Revolution, we did see an increase in fairy ring severity in those plots. Again, it's a trend. It's not very high, but it was there consistently. You'll also notice there that the untreated, which is the pink bar that has the AB on it, that has with Revolution, you can see a decrease just by applying the Revolution. So that leads us to say that in our recommendation that you shouldn't tank mix your wetting agent, but you should apply it on its normal schedule. Here, this is the same thing. Again, this is AUTBC. You can see the consistency that we had year after year, that we just had slightly higher fairy ring severity with our with Revolution treatments, tank mix with the fungicides. What was really surprising is we saw no difference in irrigation timing. So you notice here there's no letters, there's no significant difference. We saw the same amount of fairy ring whether we applied whether we watered in immediately versus whether we watered in 10 hours later. This is some more recent work that I've done at the University of Missouri. These applications, this is Turney and Balaton. These applications were made in early June and early July after we had type 2 ring formation. So in this case, I call these early curative treatments. You can see that on the right, the Balaton treatment is not holding on and not providing the fairing suppression as the tourney did in these early curative treatments. Here we can kind of see that, although it's not statistically different, we do see that the Balaton doesn't work quite as well is in the early curative stage. So if you get into June and July, Balaton is probably not your pick. However, we do see that triticonnazole, Trinity there works fairly well or very well in this strategy, as well as some of the other DMIs. Lastly here, the phytotoxicity aspect. Another reason not to tank mix Revolution in with the DMI fungicide is that we did see significantly more phyto. Now this is a slight bronzing. We're not actually talking about losing grass here, but we do have some phytotoxicity, and there's more when we applied the Balaton with the Revolution than without. For our friends down south with Bermuda greens, I should mention that not all of the DMI fungicides are labeled for Ultradwarf Bermuda grass greens, and it's very important that you're careful with the use of DMI fungicides on those greens. You can see that triticonnazole and metaconazole are not labeled because of their phytotoxicity risk. Tebuconazole is kind of in the middle ground, and Balaton and Banner Max are towards the lower end of that phytotoxicity risk. Now it's funny because for Bentgrass, you can almost completely reverse this list, and the Banner and the Balaton would probably have a little bit more phytotoxicity risk than some of the other ones. Now again, when I'm talking about phytotoxicity here, particularly with Bentgrass and Balaton, and I'll show you a picture, we're talking about just a bronzing effect. So here, this is our spring soil temperature curve, and you can see there that fairing, if we start that first application at 55 to 60 degrees, and our second application 28 days later, there's a potential that we're not only making applications targeted towards fairing, but also towards our other soil-borne diseases, take-all patch and summer patch. So one thing is for the chemicals to keep 14 days away, I talked about wetting agents and how they might decrease the performance of a preventive fungicide application. But also there's this other aspect of PGR applications, particularly Trimit, which is targeted towards suppression of Poa annua growth during the spring season. And the reason that I concentrate on the DMI fungicides Trimit interaction is because they're very similar structurally, and they're very similar in the way that they impact plants as well as fungi. Paclobutrazol or Trimit is actually a low-level fungicide and can inhibit some pathogens. So here you'll notice that up on the top there is triademifon with a benzene ring and a triazine ring, and paclobutrazol has that same type of structural formula. So we designed a study here at Missouri on 2 greens on Pen A4 and Pen Cross. We applied 4 different DMI fungicides, Torque, Balaton, Tourney, and Trinity. We applied them either alone, or we tank mixed them with Trimit, or we applied Trimit 7 days after the fungicide application, or the Trimit 14 days after. The fungicides and the tank mixes were made in late April and late May here, and all those treatments were watered in. So what we saw was quite interesting, and this is normally what we see with our DMIs, is the Balaton having maybe just a little bit more phytotoxicity risk. I kind of put the acceptable level as being 2 there, as far as the amount of that bronzing discoloration that would be acceptable. You can see that alone we never reach that unacceptable mark, but when we tank mix in, which I don't recommend because it's really a double whammy to the turf, that we see a higher level of phytotoxicity. So this is in early June, but as we get into even 5 days later, and you can see the difference here of this big jump in phytotoxicity that we have. And that you can even see it in the 7 days and the 14 days. And what happened here is our weather. So last year we had actually our June 1st to June 10th was the warmest since 1934. We got a nice early kickstart to the 2011 summer season, and we made that last 14-day application of that 16 ounces of Trimit on June 3rd, right on that date. And that really caused that spike in phytotoxicity that we saw. So if we start the DMI fungicides early enough, or the Trimit applications early enough, hopefully we can avoid these summer stress periods that really seem to set off this phytotoxic response. And just to show you what that looked like, this is a little bit later in June 17th. You can see where the boom stops and starts there. Now, if you had actually gone across a whole green, it probably would have just bronzed out some of it. But when you have it next to untreated plots or plots that aren't showing that effect, it really tends to stand out. And I should say that this phytotoxicity was short-lived. So this is later in June, and you can see for most of the treatments here, that phytotoxic response is gone. But if you look at that 14-day after Trimit, that Trimit application that was made on June 3rd, you can see that distinct spike is still kind of hanging on. So I want to finish up a little bit and talk about dollar spot as well, because there might be an opportunity here to maybe not only hit 4 or to hit 3 diseases, but maybe also to hit a foliar disease. And what these two graphs represent is what happens when you apply a fungicide before symptom expression, but when the pathogen population is actually increasing. So it's important to note that when we see symptoms, there's actually a whole lot microbially that's going on within that turf ecosystem. And there actually is the infection process that's occurring. So if we can time that fungicide to that when the pathogen population is going up and also to when the pathogens are infecting, we might be able to delay that onset of that early inoculum and perhaps even the rate of disease progression throughout the year. So at North Carolina State, they did, and this is from 2010, I should say University of Wisconsin has also done studies. They showed that early applications, and this was made actually targeted towards fairy ring and actually watered in. So you can see these are watered in DMI applications, and also there's an honor application that we are seeing a notable decrease throughout the early part of the season of dollar spot compared to untreated. So this is actually from the earlier study, the DMI Trimit study, and I just want to point out some of these pictures. And this is an untreated control. So this is July 14th, and you can see that you know, obviously the dollar spot and the brown patches is raging in the untreated plot. Similarly, this is the Trimit plots where 2 Trimit applications were made alone. But here, this is tourney, so we have some dollar spot breakthrough, but much less dollar spot than we are seeing in our untreateds. Again, it should be noted there's no other fungicides on these plots. So we have tourney, tank mix, 7-day treatment, and 14-day Trimit treatments. This is torque at the label rate at 0.6 ounces. We see that we have breakthrough there in torque. In mid-July, this is Trinity treatment, so triticonazole treatments. We can see that we have breakthrough. But what was striking is that in the Balaton treatments, it really seemed to, and actually it holds out in the statistics, that the 2 early applications, even watered in with 0.2 of an inch of water, seemed to hold on and really restrict the amount of dollar spot severity we saw throughout the season. And you can see that the Balaton is not working for the brown patch, however, so we are seeing brown patch come through these plots. So just to show that, again, in graph format, now I have that red dotted line is, you know, that's probably acceptable maybe for a fairway situation. For a green situation, it probably would not be. But one thing that really is striking in these plots is those 2 applications of Balaton, how they are significantly suppressing the dollar spot epidemic well into July with those treatments that were initially targeted towards fairy ring. So just to wrap this up into one take-home message and the control recommendation is if you're targeting fairy ring or, and actually you might be able to double dip with summer patch and take-all patch, and perhaps even dollar spot, if you start off your fungicide program making 2 applications on a 28-day interval of Balaton or one of the T's at the low rate, it seems to work very well for this fairy ring preventative strategy. Initiate, now this is for the U.S. transition temperatures are about 55 to 60 degrees, which I would say for a lot of the Midwest, we're almost there. I think we're going to stay in this range for a while, so we might have a longer application window for the first one. The third point there, and this is absolutely critical, is to water in the application immediately with an 1/8 to 1/4 inch of irrigation. Again, we have to deliver that fungicide into the soil profile. If this isn't possible, make sure to water it in that evening. So I've had superintendents call and tell me that they did not have luck with this fairy ring preventative strategy, and when we boil it down and we investigate it, it never got watered in, or it was watered in the next night instead of that evening. Do not tank mix a wetting agent with a preventative application. However, if you're going after fairy ring curatively and you already have an epidemic, it is critical that you add a wetting agent as a tank mix to try and deliver that fungicide through the soil profile and through that hydrophobic layer. I would say at this point through our 1 year of data that I would not tank mix, trim it with a preventative application. You might be able to time it 7 days apart, but I would probably prefer 14 days. So if you have an application, say in early April and early May, you may target your first trim it application for mid-March and mid-April, or somewhere timed away from the DMI applications. And then the last point there is that we've seen that Balaton seems to provide the longest residual dollar spot control of the DMIs that we've tested. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Just some email address if you want to get a hold of me. I'm on Twitter as well. Soon to have a Facebook page probably for our program. At the bottom there is the URL for our website. I do publish some disease reports, and we'll be updating that quite frequently. So with that, I will turn it back over to Frank and answer some of your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lee. That was a great seminar. Just a reminder, as far as receiving educational credits for this webinar, here's the GCSAA code. Please use that to obtain your credits for sitting in our seminar session today. And I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy, do you have, or actually before I do that, just remember that feel free to use the Q&A interface on your webpage there to ask questions as we go into this Q&A session. And Jimmy, do you got any questions that were fielded by the audience for Dr. Miller at this time?
I've got one question for Dr. Miller to start, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but the way the season seems to be going, especially across the Midwest and the Northeast, how do you predict this as the timing of these first applications for take-all patch and fairy ring, and then as we move into the season, do you anticipate that we need to be worried about additional applications, or do you think that as long as the weather conditions don't progress, that they actually still have a longer window for that first app?
Well, I think that if you kind of follow what's going along with crabgrass, we have some lawn care operators here that are considering going to 3 applications instead of just splitting into 2 applications. I think if there's a significant history of fairy ring on the course, I think this isn't a bad idea. If you have to make one now because we're in the window, and then you would time one 28 days later and then time a third one 28 days later, just to make sure that you're getting that last application to where it's going to last out into the summer, well into the summer season. So I've been asked a couple of times if I recommend 3 applications. To be quite honest, though, I don't have a frame of reference for this spring. We're kind of in a historical period here. So you kind of go through 3 seasons, which you feel are typical, and then you get into one like this, and I think for safety's sake, if there's a significant history of fairing on the course, I would definitely consider making 3 applications instead of 2 and having the first one go down now.
Great. Well, this question comes in from Paul Jett from Pinehurst, North Carolina. And this goes back to the fairy ring control, and Paul was wondering, what rate did you find effective for tebuconazole used for fairy ring control, and does the 0.6 ounce rate for that product provide acceptable control?
I have seen that the 0.6 ounce rate does provide the acceptable control in this, at least in the studies that I've done. You would note that the early one kind of had a grams AI per, I think it was grams AI per 1,000. And the reason for that is that I've tested a different formulation more than the product that's out now. I would caution that there are some definite issues with formulation. I'm always a little, I'm considerably more confident when I actually test the product and the AI and the formulation that it's going to be in. But that 0.6, is right about at that level of the lower rate of the tebuconazole that I tested most in my studies.
Great. Thanks, Lee. Jimmy, do you have some questions there?
Yes, we've got a question from Shadow Glen in Kansas City area, and the question is, do I need to worry about Pythium velutum in Kansas City?
Well, we don't know that. Pythium velutum is kind of the rule breaker of Pythiums in my mind. Pythium velutum is much more prevalent on new greens. So if you have greens that are older than 5 years old, for the most part I would say that Pythium velutum is probably not an issue. It's also really likes drier areas. So Pythium velutum really follows kind of the take-all patch scheme. And that's where it starts to infect in the spring when soil temperatures are 55 to 70 degrees. And then you don't see the symptoms until we get into the summer stress period. And it tends to like I said, drier sand-based soils. Now if we contrast that to Pythium root rot, which I've seen a lot of since I've been here in the Midwest, Pythium root rot likes it wet, likes plugged up soils. There's a distinct necrosis to the roots. So one thing that we're actually working on now, actually we'll be starting a project this summer, is to try to characterize the root infecting Pythium species here in the Midwest, and try to figure out, do we have root dysfunction here, and if we do, what kind of levels do we have it at?
Great, thanks. I've got a question from Mike in Minnesota. Question is, if you're recommending 3 applications this season for control, what do you think about using something like Triton Flow as that 3rd application?
Well, one key word I heard there was Minnesota. I'm not sure if Minnesota you're going to need to make 3 applications. The reason is I doubt that your soil temperatures are up to that 55 to 60 yet. And if they are, I'm not sure that they're going to stay there. So for Minnesota, I'm not sure I would recommend 3 applications. I do like using Triton Flow as that last application, though. if you are going to get kind of closer to the summer stress period. The major reason for that is that there's a reduced risk for phytotoxicity, and you also have the green pigment or the stress guard pigment in it. So you kind of get that, a little bit of that double whammy of protecting the plant from heat stress and potential phytotoxicity.
Cool. Again, if there's any questions, please utilize the web interface there to go ahead and put them in. We've still got a few more minutes here before we wrap up the session, if you guys have any burning questions. Jimmy, did you have anything left on your plate there?
I think you pretty well covered it, and I thank Dr. Miller for his time and the good information.
Okay.
It was my pleasure, Jimmy, and again, thank you for the forum and for allowing us to get this kind of information out, and hopefully that the superintendents out there will be able to, and turf managers will be able to use this in a way that will help them in their program and reduce the amount of fairing we see out there.
Great. Thanks again, Dr. Miller. And don't forget that our next Bayer Beyond the Basics webinar will be coming on Tuesday, April 24th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will be actually talking about minimizing summer stress for cool season turf grass. So I look forward to seeing you guys there at that webinar. And thanks again, Lee, for all the great information.
Frank, we've got one more last question, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, you do. Okay, great.
And this question is from Keith. What do you think about the recommendation of ProStar 60 days after that second Balaton out?
Well, I think that's probably a final nail in the coffin. For me, I think that ProStar should really be reserved more for that curative application strategy. So by going 60 days later, you're really kind of targeting when that fairy ring would be most active. So in that respect, you're kind of looking at it as that, you know, almost a knockdown type of application. So, you know, I don't think it's a bad idea, but I think you might be able to wait until the early stages of maybe seeing the fairy ring start to liven up if you do start to get those green ring symptoms, and then be really on top of it and apply then, instead of maybe just doing a blanket application 60 days later.
Great. Well, it looks like all the questions. So again, thank you, and thank everyone for participating.
Thank you.
This concludes today's web seminar. You may now disconnect.